All right, let's see what you guys thought about today's discussion. But first, I need to open the textbook. Okay, so question 1 about writing lies and truth. Let's take a look at this one. 49. Writing seemed to matter after all. It wasn't all lies. And even if it was, then you could examine that lie, work it, and stitch it into the fabric of your truth. So I talked with a group about this part, and their idea is that when humans use words, then there will always be some subjective bias, even simply in the words that we choose to use. And if we recognize this fact, then we can examine that bias. We can work with it, like try to make sense of that bias, to try to understand the author's position or their thinking. And then we can uh, stitch it into the fabric of your truth. So we can take that understanding into account when we try to figure out what is actually going on, like inside or uh, within this bias. So far, so good. But we can also look at it from the other perspective. Like this seems to make sense. But then the group I was talking about this with thought about it a bit more. And they noticed um, a challenge or an obstacle. If we agree that all writing is biased in some way, can we always notice exactly where the bias is? If we find one or two places, can we be sure that everything else is not biased? How exactly do we examine the bias if we can't be sure that we always notice where it is? And then another challenge is, what do you mean by biased? Is there some clear standard of neutrality existing somewhere, and you can just compare this piece with that standard and you can find out where the bias is? Or is bias and the judgment of bias different for each person? If I think this is biased, maybe you will not agree. So in that case, we're not looking for something neutral or something unbiased. We're working to see how the author's bias is different from mine, and whether we can use that fact to understand more about the author, understand more about the true meaning of what they write, given their thinking and given my thinking. So it's not about looking for the truth, it's about looking for, as it says here, your truth. What makes sense to you? How do you make sense of a piece of writing? So that's the sentence itself. But here, Saleh mentions this idea in context. There's a reason for him to think this, that writing seemed to matter after all. This comes after he has a text message exchange with H. Uh, the H had been reading the Marcel Proust book, and he would send via text message to my new phone peculiar sentences that seemed like his own out of context ideas and mutations from French via English into Persian. Gilbert is not unlike an unstable country with whom you should never form an alliance. One time I replied with a simple question mark. And he came back with, Dargancourt appeared gentle since he lacked the physical ability to express that he was still rather mean. I wrote back, your English has improved so vastly that you are able to read this stuff and understand it. H. But my writing in that language is still poor, too poor, and my true wish is to be able to read it in the original French. Me. Next lifetime, inshallah. H. All of humankind is in this book, you know. Me. Appears that way. H was taking credit alongside Ajuj and Majuj, the two government screenwriters, for the Abbas TV show's success. As my handler, he could explain to his superiors that it was really via his insistence that I come up with a new pilot for the war that the show had been given new life. Those Marcel Proust sentences he was sending me via text message were his way of expressing that he approved of the TV work, but he still hadn't forgotten that sooner or later I had to get back to Iraq and find the actual owner of the volume. One day, I found an old translated copy of the novel in a bookshop near the University of Tehran. It was a fair translation of Marcel Proust into Persian. Not great, but not a disaster either. I bought it and went straight to a line I vaguely recalled. I wrote to H in the Persian translation, the nature of the moment meant that he had to entertain a mediocre crowd. To which H replied in English, it felt fraudulent, like a book written in forced vernacular. By the way, vernacular means everyday language. When I wrote nothing back, he added, a book with theories in it is an object that still displays its price tag. Of all the people in Tehran, my interrogator had become my one and only interlocutor, my savior, my saint. And then after this, he says, oh, apparently writing does matter. So, like, why does this make Saleh think that writing, in fact, could matter? We here have two pieces of writing. The first one, the one that is easiest to discuss, is that TV show that he has been forced to write about the legendary sniper in 2006 Iraq. And the show is quite successful. Earlier, we read that, in fact, Saleh is not taking this show very seriously. He just writes random, absurd stuff. And these two government screenwriters somehow turned it into a TV show that everybody likes. So this, I think, is an example of writing that does not matter. Saleh doesn't take it seriously. The government is using it for propaganda, right? Last week, we talked about how can art convey some kind of message. So the government isn't treating this as art, it's treating it as a message. So it's not very meaningful writing. The other piece of writing is remembrance of things past, or I guess the newest English title is In Search of Lost Time, the book by Marcel Proust. And we get fragments, right? We get decontextualized sentences. The language apparently is also not exactly the same as in the book. I did not pick up an English copy to compare. If you don't know, this book is 7 volumes long. I didn't have time to track down each sentence. But according to Saleh, these sentences have been distorted through translation. You know, anytime an author includes individual sentences from other works, You have to think there has to be some kind of reason that the author chooses these sentences and not other sentences. So, and then, of course, in this context, they are having some kind of conversation using these fragments. So we can take a closer look and see if we can make it make more sense. So the first one, Gilbert is not unlike an unstable country with whom you should never form an alliance. Okay, so that idea seems quite clear, right? Some countries are unstable, they are not loyal, they change sides frequently. So you should not form an alliance with this kind of country. Can this describe a person? Are there some people who change their minds frequently? So it's hard to get a kind of commitment from them to be sure of what they will or will not do or say. There are, right? Some people are like this. In English, we call them flaky. They are undependable, change their minds often. So why would H send this text to Saleh? Is he perhaps warning Saleh? You have agreed to find the author of the book. Don't change your mind. Or like, we have communicated about the rules that the government has for you. Follow those rules. Don't do anything weird. That seems to be one interpretation of this fragment. And then when Saleh asks basically, what the fuck? H replies, D'Argencourt appeared gentle since he lacked the physical ability to express that he was still rather mean. Okay, so this idea may be less familiar, but apparently what it's saying is that someone is not actually gentle and like kind, but they appear this way because they are not able to express actually how mean they are. They don't know how to let other people know that they are not in fact this gentle and kind. Have you ever met someone like this before? Like maybe on the surface they seem like a kind and nice person, but when you start talking to them and you become more familiar with their thoughts, it turns out they have a lot of like angry thoughts or negative thoughts. I think some of you have met this kind of person before. So why would H say this? There's a gap between apparent niceness versus internal meanness. So maybe H is saying like, I sound friendly when we talk, but actually I'm prepared to force you to follow orders. Or maybe H is describing how he thinks of Saleh, like you pretend like you are always obedient and loyal, but actually you don't like the government, you don't like me very much. This one is more ambiguous. It could describe more than one thing. And that's also why it's kind of interesting, right? When you're talking with a state interrogator, you want to try to find out what they're thinking. So that you know whether you will or will not get into trouble. But here, H is kind of deliberately sending out an ambiguous text. I think we mentioned before, this is also a kind of classic strategy. Maybe we didn't say this, but in censorship, especially government censorship, one common strategy is to not tell you what the standard is. to not tell you where the red line that you should not cross is. And this is advantageous for the government because it's therefore, first of all, if you do try to find the red line, it is more likely that you will cross it somehow, and the government therefore has an excuse to punish you. On the other hand, if you know this, you might try to stay as far away from that line as possible, so to make it less likely you will accidentally break the rules. And in that case, the government has succeeded very much in getting everybody to censor themselves. So by not drawing a clear line and telling you don't cross this line, it results in more effective censorship. And I think most of us think that's a bad thing. But that's kind of what H is doing here. He's maybe giving a warning, like you shouldn't do one thing, say one thing and do another, but he doesn't point out what he's talking about. So the one purpose could be to make Saleh more anxious, more scared, and therefore prevent him from doing certain things that the government does not want him to do. Saleh doesn't respond to the content of the message, he responds to the fact of the message itself, right? Your English has improved. This is kind of funny to me because Saleh is talking to his state interrogator. H has all the power. H is like the boss in this relationship. But Saleh is praising his English has improved, like he's his English teacher. In a sense, you can say that this attitude is also Saleh's way of fighting against censorship, to try to maintain some control of the situation. And H, as we know from earlier in the book, is not your traditional interrogator. It doesn't feel like he wanted to be a state interrogator. He just kind of found his way to this job. So he also replies in a similar way, my true wish is to be able to read it in the original French. And he even says all of humankind is in this book, this is a very literary thing to say. It's a very literary way of praising a masterpiece. All of human life is in this book. This entire exchange to me is quite funny because, again, H is a state interrogator. And here they're having like a very abstract discussion about French literature. It's so absurd. And even funnier is they're right. They're absolutely right in their evaluation of this book. Okay, and then we have 3 more fragments here. Saleh writes to H, the nature of the moment meant that he had to entertain a mediocre crowd. So like this group of people who don't appreciate great art because of some specific circumstances, you have to please them anyway. And this seems to be related to that TV show. Saleh knows it's not great art. He doesn't care about it. He doesn't like the government. He doesn't like the people who enjoy this. But the nature of the moment meant that he had to entertain a mediocre crowd. And then H replies, also very interesting, it felt fraudulent like a book written in forced vernacular. So it feels like you're not being honest, like you're writing using a kind of ordinary language that you are not suited to. So is he criticizing the TV show? Is he telling Saleh, I can tell you're not putting your heart into this, that you're not treating this seriously? Saleh apparently gets the message because he doesn't reply. And then H gives us our last fragment. A book with theories in it is an object that still displays its price tag. So this apparently is related to one major idea about literature that we discussed earlier, right? That literature should not have a message or should not be forced to have a message. If we carry this idea to the extreme, some people believe that art should not have a message at all, whether it's the artist's message or somebody else's message. It should be for something like beauty. And this idea is called art for art's sake. And apparently, this is what this sentence is referring to. A book with theories in it is an object that still displays its price tag. If a work of literature is not just about the art and the beauty, if it does have some kind of theory or message, then it is not art separate from the world. It is art that the world has some kind of control over. The word in English here is purchase, not to buy, but purchase as in traction, as in control. You have some purchase over the situation, means you have some influence or control over the situation. Because of course, like one of the main forms of control is money. So here the sentence apparently means a work of art that has a message is not real art. It is still part of this world. It is influenced by the world. It is controlled by the world and its money. Which is a crazy thing for H to say. H wanted Saleh to write this TV show for the government, and now he's saying that it's not real art. I mean, of course, it's not real art, but H is saying this. Is this some kind of reminder to Saleh, or is it kind of like comforting him? Apparently, Saleh does feel comforted, right? After this message, he says that H had become my one and only interlocutor, the only person I can talk to, my savior, my saint. So apparently H is telling Saleh, I understand how you feel. And it works. um, this is very high level state control. Again, for effective censorship and interrogation, the one thing you absolutely should not do is make your subject feel like your enemies. So like if you watch, an American cop show and they grab the suspect and they put him in a room, usually him, and they like get really mad at him, they shout at him and they try to force him to confess, that doesn't work. Or if the person does confess, it might be a false confession. They just want to get out of that room. What really works to get somebody to confess is to make them feel like they can trust you, to make them feel like you have some kind of connection, that you understand them. Everybody likes to share their thoughts, their ideas, especially if somebody is a criminal and they feel like they got away with it. They also like to share, to brag that they managed to escape the law. And according to research, this feeling of wanting to share is stronger than the feeling of wanting to keep the secret from the police. In other words, in this kind of interrogation, the suspect will share the truth with the police, even though they know they are talking to the police. Crazy, right? But apparently that's what happens. So this is the kind of thing that H could be doing here. Building a connection to make Saleh feel like H understands him, and therefore to make Saleh more likely to share information with H, or to maybe be willing to obey H's orders in the future. So, at the beginning of the novel, Saleh is like, H is not your usual interrogator. He's actually kind of friendly. He doesn't feel like he belongs in this role. But in fact, that is the most effective kind of interrogator. Someone you feel like you can understand. You feel like maybe they understand you as well. That's where shit gets dangerous. And that is why everybody says, if the police tell you they think you committed a crime, whether you did or not, you should get a lawyer. It's all words, man. It's a word trap. So you need a word expert, a language expert, a lawyer. Okay, thoughts or questions about number one? So, in fact, when Saleh then says, writing seemed to matter after all, we can say that he has been tricked by his interrogator. No thoughts or questions further? All right, so moving on to number two, Mafiha and the censors. Is he really fighting the censorship on page 51? Okay, so he went to the gym and then to the sauna with the heads of the censorship department every afternoon to plead our cases. He was a hero because everyone assumed that he fought for us to be less censored by the powers that be. So the question is the word assumed. Everyone assumes. Why does the novel use this word? Why doesn't the novel just say he did this? Apparently the novel, or we can say Saleh, wants to introduce a feeling of uncertainty. Maybe this is not actually what's happening. So I talked with the group about this question, and they said that maybe Mafiha isn't there to fight against censorship. Maybe he is there to take orders, to make sure he understands exactly what it is that the censors want him and his newspaper to do. And that people only assume this is that he's fighting the censors because it gives them hope. It makes them feel like they're working for the right boss. Because it's much less painful than assuming that he's going over to make sure he follows the government. Especially because they're all journalists who should be more committed to telling the truth than to spreading government messages. And so in discussing this question with the group, we also talked about like how writers, journalists, artists, etc. survive under government censorship. And in Taiwan, we don't have a lot of government censorship. We do have a little. Like you can't talk about certain subjects or use certain words during the day for like children's programming, right? These are censorship rules that most countries have. But we don't have more political or serious kinds of censorship. So we may not have thought about this question. How does a journalist continue to tell the truth when the government is trying to censor journalism? And the discussion about like what exactly is Mafiha doing every day with the censors kind of helps us understand this question. If every day he goes to fight the censors, then the group I talked with thinks that maybe that would result in the newspaper getting shut down. Because they are the government, they do have the power. So the main reason Mafiha probably is not fighting the censors every day is to keep his newspaper alive. On the other hand, if your newspaper is alive, but the only thing you can print are government propaganda, you may as well let it die out because it's not a valuable newspaper. So Mafiha, even if he doesn't care about the truth, for economic reasons, to keep his newspaper alive, also for like social reasons, right? It's supposedly like better to own a newspaper, it makes you famous or something. Anyway, it's to his advantage to keep the newspaper alive, um, and meaningful and significant to make people want to read it. So he's not just going over to follow orders all the time either. He's probably doing something in the middle. Most of the time, he's like listening and obeying. And then once in a while, he might be saying, well, maybe that's not the best thing. Maybe we can try something else. But he's probably not like, it says here to plead his case, which means to explain why the censor's ideas are not the best ideas, why maybe his ideas are sometimes better. So it's not, the language here is not that confrontational. It's not a fight. But he's also probably not pleading every day because that would make the censors very annoyed, and you don't want to annoy the censors. Um, I think we have a comparison later on in today's reading uh, with Atya. I can't remember what it is, but I remember something related. Oh no, that takes us to the beginning. Okay, so I have to look for this with my own two eyes. Um, oh yeah, so the citizen is being bought out. Uh, and Saleh says that this is a familiar experience for the place they work for to get bought out. I am on page 53. The citizen will change hands and we will all leave en masse, which means we will all resign together. This sort of thing happens so often that Atya and I and the others were used to it. Some merchant or politician with 10,000 kilos of dirty money under his mattress would come in and buy out wherever we worked. Then he'd oversee everything we did because he wanted the paper as a platform for his political ambitions. Sooner or later, working at the journal or newspaper or publishing house would turn to shit and we'd all leave anyway. The only good thing that came out of this was that we were savvy now and did not linger until things turned nasty. We left immediately. So this is an example of what happens when, or if Mafiha completely gives up on journalistic integrity and telling the truth, and he just prints whatever the government wants him to print. The place would turn to shit. Nobody would want to work there. Nobody would want to read it. It would lose its value as a newspaper. So here back on page 51, this is something that he also would not want to do. So Mafia has a job of like walking a tightrope between always fighting and complaining versus always following orders. And that's to like, to try to gain as much independence as you can without annoying the censors. And this is the kind of struggle that writers and artists under government censorship have to deal with all the time. Thoughts or questions? Okay, let's look at number 3. Why is talking on a cell phone in a war zone suicide? Page 52. So he's thinking back to a moment when he was in battle. Just then, I was doing something that no one in their right mind should have been doing at that moment. I was on a cell phone talking to Atya in Tehran. It was suicide, but this was far from a professional war, and everybody and their mother was on their phones anyway, taking self-portraits of their own goddamn demise. Okay, so why would this be suicide? Everybody agrees. The main reason is because the enemy could track your cell phone signal. And that's true. But there are two issues with this idea. First, even if you aren't using your phone, as long as your phone has a signal, it can be tracked. So to avoid this, it's not just about not talking. You should turn off your phone during a war if you are actually fighting. The second thing is, yes, tracking soldiers' cell phone signals is a big problem today, especially in Ukraine. But this was 10 years ago. This was in 2014, 2015, when the technology was there, but it was not so common. And in those days, it was mostly the Americans who could do this. But they are not fighting the Americans. They are fighting Islamic State, which has even worse technology. So it could be possible for the enemy to track their cell phone signals, but it's not a guaranteed thing. Like there's still a bit of risk that you can take. And that's probably why, as Saleh says, everybody was using their phone. Also, again, this is like a group of different people and different countries, fighters coming together to fight one enemy. They don't have a common command communication structure. They don't all have the same walkie-talkies. They don't have the same person they should be reporting to. Instead, it's more like a complicated, entangled network. So, like, if they can't use their phones, what are they going to use? Messenger pigeons? There's nothing else. So everybody was using their phone. And then also Facebook, right? Taking pictures of their death. Again, kind of funny in a very dark way. So this is the first layer. But the group I talked to also thought of a few other ideas. So another idea could be the psychology. If you're on the phone talking to somebody, you are not fully paying attention to your environment. That's dangerous if you're driving. It's even more dangerous when you're in a goddamn war. We've already read about how one of the best snipers in Saleh's group died because he stepped on a tripwire, like a trap. And in modern warfare, so it's not just about the enemy in front of you, it's also about the enemy beneath your feet and the enemy above your head in the sky. You really need to be paying attention if you're fighting in a war. So like talking on the phone in the middle of a war zone, in the middle of a battle, is not a good idea. And then one last idea that this group came up with is that like this specific context is not just any soldier talking on the phone to any random person or their mother. It's Saleh talking on the phone with Atya, the one who got away, the love of his life. So like he's in the middle, he's literally in the middle of a battle on the phone with the love of his life. Isn't that romantic? So by doing this, we can say that he's kind of tempting fate. He knows that it's dangerous. He knows it makes it more likely for him to be bombed, but it's Atya, so he does it anyway. And the fact that he does get bombed and is not hurt kind of tells us that he is fated not to die today. It is not his destiny to die today. And then we also get a small confirmation that Atya really does love him as well. When he calls her back and says, Atya, I'm not dead. She had cried into the phone. She really does care about him a lot. Okay, other thoughts or questions about number 3? All right, let's take a long break. We'll come back at 11:10. Question 4. Saleh says of Miss Homa, in the winter of her life, she had suddenly become too famous. It was almost a slap in the face. So let's take a look at this on page 55. Here. So this is in the context of Miss Homa has asked Saleh to take her to Karbala for the Arba'in religious festival, and there she wants to die as like a religious martyr. So Saleh is thinking like, why would she want to die when she's so famous and rich? And his answer is, in the winter of her life, she had suddenly become too famous. What was she going to do with this fame so late in the game? It was almost a slap in the face. So the group I talked with believes that here the insult, the slap in the face, is the fact that Miss Homa has been painting for many years, but only now is she becoming famous. The idea seems to be that, Miss Homa's art has not changed a lot. She keeps on painting like minarets and mosques, but only recently have people started to realize how good these paintings are. Only recently have people started to connect with her art, even though her art has been like this for many years. So it's kind of like insulting to think like she has always been this good, and yet so few people knew about her. And that could make sense. For some artists, they change over time. And so maybe in each moment of their career, it doesn't feel like they're that great. But if you look at how they have changed over time, you start to see how great they really are. The group I talked with believed that for those artists, it would make more sense for them to become famous late in life. That would not be insulting. But for an artist like Miss Homa, who has been doing the same art for many years, then yes, it can feel like, oh, now you know that I'm great. Wow, late to the party. Um, there are some other ideas related to this question as well. Saleh has previously criticized the Tehran art world as being full of money launderers who don't really care about art. They just need a way to move money in and out of Iran. And the group I talked with said, even if that's true, Miss Homa's fame is not entirely fake. Like, yes, money launderers don't care about which artists they make rich and famous, but they do need to agree on certain works of art, on certain artists. They don't just like spin a dial, they don't flip a coin. They also follow some kind of signal. And so the group I talked with believed that somewhere among all of this noise, there must be a few people who really do care about art, who promote one artist or another, and all the other posers and money launderers follow that signal. So just because the art world is full of fakers and schemers does not mean that Miss Homa's fame is undeserved or fake. And then one more idea here is, what was she going to do with this fame so late in the game? Here, Saleh is talking about fame not as a result, but as a resource, as a tool. And it's not surprising because Saleh himself is a poor writer in middle age who also would desperately like to become famous and not have to worry about money ever again. So to him, fame is not the end goal. Fame is just another tool to help make life easier. But for Miss Homa, she doesn't have a lot of life left. So this resource called fame is not of very much value to her. Same with money, right? She only becomes rich and famous near her old age. Being rich in her old age cannot make up for a lack of money when she was younger. Assuming, we don't know. We don't know whether she grew up poor or not. But like the idea is the same, right? You have a lot of money that you can't take with you when you die. Same for fame. You might still be famous after you die, but you yourself will not be able to enjoy that. Uh, so that could explain this idea. Like, what was she going to do with this fame now? So this is how Saleh makes sense of her decision to die as a religious martyr. She has so much stuff that is of no use to her. What could be useful to her now? Religious faith. If she's about to leave this world, she might be thinking about the next world. And we do get some sense of this when she first requests that Saleh help her do this on page 54. Saleh asks her, Miss Homa, you've lived one of the fullest lives I know of. Now you are suddenly religious? And she replies, it has nothing to do with that, and it has everything to do with that. So I think here she's talking about two different meanings of the word religious. Apparently, Saleh is talking about like now suddenly you want to be a pious and faithful woman. You want to go to mosque every week. You want to do your daily prayers 3 times a day. You want to become this kind of person. And to that idea, Ms. Homa says no. But her motivations are related to religion, right? She says it has everything to do with it. So it's not about the form or the practice. It's about the faith, perhaps, the faith and the afterlife. Now that she's finished more or less with this world, she has achieved all that she can expect to achieve in this world. She is now looking toward the next world. That's why she wants to die on a religious pilgrimage, to give her the best starting point when she enters the next world. And so that's what Saleh thinks that Miss Homa is thinking when she asks him to take her to that place for the religious pilgrimage and to let her die there. Thoughts or questions? All right, finally, question 5. Do you think it's fair to hold Dodong to a lower standard? Let's look at this on page 57. So here, Saleh is once again being salty about Atia marrying Mafiha. And then like Mafiha is going to publish or has already published a book co-written with Dodong where like they kind of debate war and peace. So like Mafiha writes peace poetry. He represents the side of peace. Dodong does like grandiose propaganda war journalism. So he's on the side of war and they have like a book together. And Saleh feels very salty about this. So he's once again mocking Atia, mocking Mafiha to Atia's face. And so Atia responds, finally. She pointed to her theater friends. See all those people over there? They all say you're working for the state promoting war. They say you're an informant, a stooge, a warmonger, an opportunist. And he replies, if I'm an informant, what's Dodong, your husband's new best friend? The guy has made himself a virtual hero on other people's miseries in Syria. Earlier in the book, we saw Dadong. Also, Saleh describes him as like portraying himself as the hero of the war. We saw him getting some fighters to shoot their guns randomly in the air to create excitement for a news story. He's a TV journalist, right? So he needs images, he needs uh, sounds. So we know that he's not a good journalist. He's more like a propagandist. And Atya says, Dadong is different than people like us. Saleh, meaning he has never read Kant or Rousseau, never worked for any literary journals? Atya, yes, something like that, Saleh. So her answer is yes, but also something else. And that something else, I think, is that Dadong has a lower moral standard or a lower journalistic standard. So the question I talked with a group about is it fair or should we hold Dadong to a lower standard? And like, why is it fair to do this? So apparently, Saleh and Atya hold him to a lower standard. First of all, because of his propaganda reporting, he himself has a lower standard of journalism. And secondly, at least according to Saleh, because he is less well educated and less literary. Atya only kind of agrees with that, right? Something like that. I think what Atya is thinking is it's not about who you have read or have not read. It's not about whether you have read literary journals. It's about how well you understand your job as a writer. It's connected with propaganda. The idea seems to be if Dadong had read more philosophy and read more literature, he would be less likely to promote propaganda because he would have a better understanding of the power of words, of the power of literature, and like Kant and Rousseau kind of help people think about what is right, what is wrong. So Atya is only agreeing in an indirect sense, not as markers of education, but as signs of intelligence. Oh, that sounds bad. As signs of awareness of what he's doing. So the group I talked with said that no, it's not fair to hold Dadong to a lower standard because he calls himself a journalist. He is reporting on a very important story, the war. So he should be held to the same standard as every other journalist. If you're a journalist in a war, you're supposed to do good reporting. As we discussed last week, good information is hard to come by in a war zone because of the fog of war. So it's even more important for a journalist to try to tell the truth, or a truth, as we have previously discussed. But Dadong doesn't seem to be doing that. So we shouldn't hold him to a lower standard. But why are Saleh and Atya doing so? Because of his morals, because of his lack of moral education. The idea seems to be that Dadong is holding himself to a lower standard. Atya and Saleh do not expect much from him. Whereas because Atya and Saleh know that they themselves have learned about morality and literature, they expect more from each other. This is kind of the logic behind how, like, if you look at political debates, often supporters will be harder on their own candidate or party than on the other side. The idea is the other side are trash anyway. We don't expect them to do anything good. But our people are supposed to be good. And so they end up criticizing their own people more than the other side. expectations. Okay. And then also like, yeah, no, that's all I wanted to say. Other questions about number 5 or today's discussion? Okay. So if not, uh, two things. First, before next week, please read chapter 9. The second thing is I just wanted to remind you, if there's something important that I think you need to know, I will send you a class email using Moodle. Apparently this semester, new Moodle, lots of problems. I think some of you are not receiving class emails. So if you feel like something important has happened and it feels like I should be saying something to you, but you don't get my emails, you can check here on Moodle, class emails. And I will always update this date with the date of the latest class email, so you know whether you have missed anything or not. Okay. You guys have any questions about anything? No? Okay, so see you next week.